Another day, another hefty government bailout for big industry. This time, it's Mount Isa's troubled copper smelter, owned by Swiss-based global resources giant Glencore, whose biggest shareholder is Australia's 8th richest person. The facility now dependent on taxpayer money for its survival.
This is an investment in the future industrial capability of the Northwest Province in Queensland. See, the people behind me here are the real heroes of this story.
The federal and Queensland state governments today promising big money to keep a risky venture going, putting taxpayers on the hook.
It's a terrible idea. It's a short-term kind of band-aid solution, $600 million for 600 jobs, when it's unclear that this is a viable ongoing concern.
In July, Glencore closed its underground Mount Isa copper mine and warned that its smelter and Townsville refinery would lose $2.2 billion over 7 years. For the past 10 weeks, Industry Minister Tim Ayres has been working with Queensland and the company to avoid a mothballing of the copper facilities, which have now been categorised as assets of national strategic importance.
Glencore's Mount Isa smelter reinforces Australia's position as a key global supplier of copper. And in this century, part of the transition to clean energy requires a greater use of copper.
Mount Isa is not the only big smelting project on government life support. Manufacturing and resource businesses are facing high energy costs, rising wages and competition from China, which is accused of overproduction.
The amazing asset we have at Port Kembla, we make 3 million tonnes of steel a year. China is currently exporting 10 million tonnes of steel a month.
Prior to the announcement in Mount Isa, government bailouts were this year offered to the Whyalla Steelworks and for Near Star Metals smelters in Port Pirie and Hobart. Meanwhile, the Rio Tinto-owned Tomago aluminium smelter in the New South Wales Hunter region is in talks for a rescue package of its own.
We're working our way through these things in the disciplined way that Australians would expect from the Albanese Labor government. We are pro-manufacturing. We have the biggest pro-manufacturing package in Australian history.
Many of those struggling businesses would have only a few years ago been forced to solve their own problems or shut down. Since the pandemic, however, governments are increasingly willing to prop up industries with taxpayer funds, claiming benefits like guaranteeing supplies of strategic and critical minerals and helping like-minded countries avoid over-reliance on China.
We've seen China misbehaving in all kinds of ways, acting strategically, cornering markets. And so you can point to instances where this is valid.
But economics professor Richard Holden doesn't think the copper industry should get government support.
If you're propping up an industry that is not viable in the long run, where we don't have some kind of comparative advantage, then you're really doing a repeat of what we did with the Australian car industry. You're just putting off the inevitable at very significant taxpayer cost.
We have got a lot of work to do. This is not a tick and flick. We have to fight for a future made in Australia. We have to work for it.
The government's willingness to take risks with taxpayer money is helped by the fact the opposition supports the Mount Isa bailout, even as it blames the government's workplace, climate and energy policies.
Australia is getting expensive and uncompetitive, and we lose industry, important industry, that we should be maintaining sovereign capability with.
If industry and government are smart enough to navigate these conditions, our manufacturing sector will remain viable and the federal government's future made in Australia economic policy can be a reality. If we can't, we face a decline in manufacturing, similar to that which we've seen in the UK steel industry.
Today's support package, essentially a handout with almost no strings attached, has raised eyebrows, not least as there is no provision for taxpayers to benefit if the Mount Isa smelter returns to profitability.
How do you make sure that heavy industry and these very profitable resources company aren't taking governments for a ride?
It's a very difficult problem and the government has to be very aware of it. And certainly while we welcome the announcement today, especially about Glencore, yes, many of these companies are multinationals. They are highly profitable.
The rescue cash is a lifeline for the Mount Isa community, where copper mining is a primary source of jobs and income. But there are no guarantees the smelter won't need more support in future, raising doubts over whether this new rising wave of industry policy will always be taxpayer money well spent.
Without some kind of way of distinguishing the cases where this is valid from the cases where it's not, it opens the door to doing it wherever you want to from a political perspective.